Montana Territory, 1873. The sky stretched endless above the rolling prairie, a canvas of opportunity and danger that pulled drifters westward like moths to flame. In this untamed corner of America, where law bent to the will of whoever wielded the fastest gun, Yates Rutherford guided his chestnut gelding along the winding creek that marked the eastern boundary of the Lazy R Ranch. At 25, he'd already seen enough death and disappointment to last several lifetimes. The cool September breeze ruffled his sandy brown hair as he scanned the horizon, a habit formed from years spent looking over his shoulder. Though young, his blue eyes carried the weathered look of a man who'd learned early that attachment meant vulnerability, and in the West, vulnerability meant death. His father's ranch had been built on that principle: stand alone, trust no one, and survive. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and land to make his way, his father had repeated until the day outlaws had put a bullet in his chest. Yates had been 17 then, watching his mother wither away from grief the following winter. The lesson had been seared into his soul: love was a luxury that got folks killed out here. Now, as the sole owner of the Lazy R's 5,000 acres, Yates commanded respect in Cottonwood Springs. His ranch hands admired his fairness and neighboring ranchers respected his business sense, but nobody could claim to know the real Yates Rutherford. He preferred it that way. What he wanted was simple: expand the Lazy R, make it the most prosperous ranch in the territory. What he needed, though buried so deep he scarcely acknowledged it, was something to fill the hollow spaces that echoed with loneliness on cold Montana nights. He just turned his horse toward home when a gunshot cracked the afternoon stillness. Yates instinctively drew his Colt and pressed his heels to his horse's flanks, racing toward the sound. 2 more shots followed in quick succession. Cresting a gentle rise, he spotted a stagecoach stopped awkwardly in the road, one wheel cocked at an unnatural angle. 3 men on horseback circled it like wolves. As Yates watched, one of the passengers fired a warning shot from the window. "Damn fool," Yates muttered. Outnumbered and outgunned, whoever was inside was only delaying the inevitable. He should ride for the sheriff, that would be the sensible thing. This wasn't his fight, but the coach was on Lazy R land, and something in him refused to stand by while innocents were harmed on his property. Cursing his own impulsiveness, Yates guided his horse behind a stand of cottonwoods and approached from the ridge above. When he was within range, he fired 3 shots in rapid succession over the bandits' heads. "This is Lazy R property," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "And you boys are trespassing." The outlaws spun, searching for the source of the voice. "There's just one of him," shouted one, raising his rifle. Yates' next shot kicked up dirt at the man's horse's hooves, causing the animal to rear. "My next one won't miss. Clear out or I start shooting for real." The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly calculating their odds. Yates kept his revolver trained on them, his hand steady. After a tense moment, the apparent leader nodded to his companions, and they slowly backed their horses away. "This ain't over," the leader called, before the 3 galloped off toward the foothills. Only when they were well away did Yates approach the stagecoach. "You folks all right in there?" he called, keeping his gun ready. The coach door swung open, and Yates found himself staring into the barrel of a small derringer held by the steadiest female hand he'd ever seen. Behind it were the most striking green eyes, set in a face that made him momentarily forget the weapon pointed at his chest. "Are you with them?" demanded the young woman, her voice clear and unwavering. "Ma'am, if I were with them, I wouldn't have run them off," Yates replied, holstering his weapon slowly. "Yates Rutherford, this is my land you're sitting on." The derringer lowered slightly. "Grace Fremont," she replied, studying him carefully. "Those men have been following our stage since we left Helena." For the first time, Yates noticed the older man slumped against the opposite seat, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "Your companion's hurt." "My uncle," Grace said, her composure cracking slightly. "They shot him when he tried to defend the coach." She was perhaps 22 or 23, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a practical bun, though wisps had escaped to frame her face. Her traveling dress was simple but well-made, dusty from the journey, but of quality fabric that spoke of Eastern means. What struck Yates most was the determined set of her jaw, even as worry clouded her eyes. "The wheel's broken and our driver," she glanced toward the front of the coach where a body lay motionless on the ground. My ranch is 3 miles west, Yates said, making a quick decision. We need to get your uncle there before those bandits circle back with reinforcements. Grace nodded, her practical nature asserting itself over fear. Can you help me get him out? Together they managed to ease her uncle out of the coach and onto Yates' horse. The older man groaned but remained unconscious. I'll lead the horse, Yates said. Can you walk? I've been cooped up in that coach for 2 days, Grace replied with unexpected spirit. Walking will be a relief. As they set off toward the Lazy R, Yates found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. There was something about the way she carried herself, a dignity that remained intact despite the dirt on her hem and the strain of their circumstances. You're a long way from anywhere civilized, he observed. What brings you to Montana territory? Grace kept pace beside him, her strides purposeful. Freedom, she said simply, a chance to build something that belongs to me alone. A small smile touched her lips. Uncle William inherited some land near Cottonwood Springs. He's getting on in years and offered to split it with me if I'd help establish it. You're planning to homestead? Yates couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Begging your pardon, but that's no life for a woman, Grace finished, a spark of defiance in her eyes. That's precisely why I came west, Mr. Rutherford. In Boston, I was expected to marry well and disappear into my husband's life. Here, I can own property, build a business, make my own decisions. Yates shook his head. The territory's no place for grand ideas, Miss Fremont. Out here, it's about survival, plain and simple. And why can't survival and freedom exist together? She challenged. Before Yates could formulate a response, William Fremont groaned and shifted on the horse. Grace's attention immediately returned to her uncle, concern replacing the fire in her eyes. Yates was oddly grateful for the interruption. Something about this woman's presence unsettled him, challenged notions he'd long accepted as truth. The Lazy R came into view as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The main house sat proudly on a slight rise, a substantial 2-story structure built of local timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Nearby stood a bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings that comprised the heart of Yates' operation. As they approached, ranch hands spotted them and rushed to assist. Yates barked orders, and soon William Fremont was being carried into the house and laid in the spare bedroom. The ranch cook, a robust woman named Mrs. Hannigan, immediately took charge of tending the wounded man. Bullet went clean through his shoulder, she reported after examination. He's lost blood, but if infection doesn't set in, he should recover. Grace sagged with relief, and Yates found himself reaching out to steady her. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and he withdrew his hand quickly. You'll both stay here until he's well enough to travel, Yates said, the invitation surprising even himself. I'll send someone to retrieve your luggage from the coach and report the attack to Sheriff Dawson. I couldn't impose, Grace began. It's no imposition, Yates interrupted. It's the decent thing to do. He turned to leave, suddenly eager to escape the confines of the room and the unsettling presence of Grace Fremont. Mr. Rutherford, she called after him. When he paused at the doorway, she continued, Thank you, not everyone would have intervened today. There was a sincerity in her voice that pierced through his usual defenses. Yates nodded once and left without reply, disturbed by how easily this stranger had stirred emotions he'd long considered safely buried. Over the next several days, William Fremont's condition gradually improved. Grace divided her time between nursing her uncle and exploring the ranch, often accompanying Mrs. Hannigan as she went about her duties. Yates found himself inventing reasons to be elsewhere, unnerved by his growing awareness of Grace's presence. But on the 4th evening, as he sat on the porch watching darkness settle over the land, she found him. Your foreman says you've been working from sunup to sundown every day, Grace remarked, settling into the chair beside him without invitation. Are you always so dedicated, or are you avoiding your house guests? Yates glanced at her, surprised by her directness. In the fading light, with her hair loosened from its usual severe style, she looked younger, softer somehow. Running a ranch doesn't leave much time for social calls, he replied, keeping his tone neutral. No, I suppose it doesn't. Grace gazed out at the vista before them. It's beautiful here. I can see why you fight to hold on to it. Something in her quiet appreciation touched him. My father built this place from nothing, Yates found himself saying. Came out here with just a wagon and a dream, they say. By the time I was born, he'd built the Lazy R into something worth having. And worth defending, Grace added, like you did for us on the road. Yates shrugged. Any man would have done the same. No, she said with certainty, not any man. Most would have ridden the other way, she studied him openly. You present yourself as someone only concerned with his own affairs, Mr. Rutherford, but your actions tell a different story. Her insight made him uncomfortable. Yates stood abruptly. It's getting late, Mrs. Hannigan will have breakfast ready at 6. As he turned to go, Grace spoke again, her voice soft but clear in the gathering dusk. I've been thinking about what you said about the territory being only about survival. I think you're wrong. Everywhere I look here, I see possibility. Even in this ranch, I see not just survival but a life you've built. Her words followed him inside, echoing in his mind as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering why the practiced isolation that had served him for years suddenly felt hollow. The next morning, Sheriff Dawson rode out to the Lazy R with news that turned the household on its head. The men who attacked your coach weren't ordinary bandits, he informed them as they gathered in the sitting room. Based on the descriptions, we believe they're part of the Harker gang. They've been terrorizing stagecoaches and settlements across 3 territories. What would they want with us? Grace asked, perplexed. We carried nothing of particular value. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we have reason to believe they weren't after valuables. Tucker Harker has taken to abducting women in his raids. 2 young ladies have disappeared from attacked coaches in the past month. Yates felt a cold fury building inside him as he watched the color drain from Grace's face. You're saying they were after Miss Fremont specifically? Can't say for certain, but it fits their pattern, Dawson replied. Word is they sell the women to mining camps up north where females are scarce. William Fremont, still weak but alert, spoke up from his chair. Then we must continue to Cottonwood Springs as soon as possible. Our land there has a cabin already built. We'll be safer there than continuing to impose on Mr. Rutherford's hospitality. With all due respect, sir, Yates interjected, a remote cabin with just you and your niece would be an easy target. The Lazy R has 15 hands, all armed and capable. You're safer here until the Harkers are caught. Grace looked at him with surprise. You've already done so much, Mr. Rutherford. We couldn't possibly. It's decided, Yates said firmly, surprised by his own vehemence. You'll stay until the danger's past. Later, when the sheriff had departed with promises to increase patrols, Yates found himself cornered by Grace in the barn where he'd gone to check on a pregnant mare. I appreciate your concern, she began without preamble, but I won't be treated like a helpless china doll. If we're to stay here, I intend to earn my keep. Yates straightened from examining the mare's leg. Miss Fremont. Grace, she corrected him, if we're to be housemates for the foreseeable future, I think we can dispense with formalities. Grace, he conceded, finding he liked the feel of her name. This isn't Boston. Ranch work is hard, dangerous, unsuitable for a woman, she finished with a raised eyebrow. I've heard it all before, but I didn't come west to be protected and pampered. I came to build something of my own, to live by my own strength. Her determination both frustrated and fascinated him. What exactly do you propose? I kept books for my father's shipping business in Boston, she replied. Your foreman mentioned you're behind on your accounts. I could help there, and I'm a fair hand with horses. My uncle taught me to ride and care for them when I was a girl. Yates studied her, noting the practical way she'd pinned up her hair and the simple work dress she wore. Perhaps there was more to Grace Fremont than he'd initially assumed. All right, he said finally. You can help Mrs. Hannigan with the household and assist my foreman Jenkins with the accounts. But you don't go anywhere alone, not with the Harkers still out there. Understood. Grace smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through Yates' chest. Perfectly. True to her word, Grace proved herself useful around the ranch. Her organizational skills brought order to the chaotic ledgers Jenkins had been struggling with for months. She assisted Mrs. Hannigan efficiently and even helped tend to minor injuries among the ranch hands with a steady hand and practical knowledge. William Fremont recovered slowly but steadily. Though initially restless about the delay in reaching their own property, he soon settled into ranch life, sharing stories of his younger days as a cavalry officer with the hands during evening meals. Yates found himself increasingly drawn into their orbit. What had begun as reluctant hospitality evolved into genuine interest. Despite his best efforts to maintain his distance, he discovered himself lingering over breakfast to hear Grace's observations or seeking her opinion on ranch matters. One crisp October afternoon, Yates found Grace in the corral, gently working with a skittish young filly that had thus far resisted training. He paused to watch, impressed by her patience and the soft, reassuring tone she used as she slowly approached the nervous animal. "She hasn't led anyone that close before," he commented as Grace managed to stroke the filly's neck. Grace smiled without taking her eyes from the horse. "She's just frightened. Sometimes the things we fear most are the very things we need." The simple observation struck him as profound. "Where did you learn to handle horses like that?" "My uncle," she replied, gradually slipping a rope around the filly's neck. "After my parents died of influenza when I was 16, Uncle William took me in. He had a small farm outside Boston where he kept a few horses. He taught me that animals, like people, respond better to patience than force." Yates leaned against the fence rail, watching as she worked. "You said you came west for freedom. What kind of freedom did you have in mind?" Grace led the filly in a slow circle, considering the question. "The freedom to determine my own path. To succeed or fail by my own efforts." She glanced at him. "In Boston, my future was predetermined: marriage to someone suitable, a life defined by my husband's position. Here," she gestured to the open landscape, "here I can be judged by what I build, not who I marry." "And what do you want to build?" Yates found himself genuinely curious. "Uncle William's land includes a small apple orchard that's been neglected. I want to restore it, expand it." Her eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Back east, I studied horticulture, against the advice of everyone who thought it an unsuitable interest for a lady. I believe hardy apple varieties could thrive here with proper care." The passion in her voice resonated with something in Yates. He recognized the same drive that had pushed him to expand the Lazy R after his father's death. "An orchard is a long-term investment," he observed. "Takes years before trees bear proper fruit." "Yes," she agreed, meeting his eyes directly, "but isn't anything worthwhile a long-term investment? Your ranch didn't spring up overnight." The question lingered between them, carrying weight beyond the obvious. Yates looked away first, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the afternoon light caught golden highlights in her hair. "I should check on the men bringing in the North Pasture herd," he said, retreating to safer ground. "Of course," Grace replied, a knowing look in her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what he was doing. As October gave way to November, the first snows dusted the mountains. William Fremont had recovered enough to move about freely, though a lingering weakness in his injured arm concerned Grace. The threat of the Harker gang still loomed, with reports of their activities filtering in from neighboring territories, but no sign of them near Cottonwood Springs. Ranch life settled into a rhythm, with Grace and her uncle integrated into daily activities. Yates found himself looking forward to evenings when they would gather in the sitting room, Grace often reading aloud while he and William played chess. It was a domestic tranquility he'd never experienced, not even when his parents were alive, and that's what frightened him. He was growing accustomed to their presence, to Grace's quick mind and quicker smile, to the way she challenged his solitary worldview. Every instinct honed by years of frontier life warned him of the danger in such attachment. The decision to finally visit the Fremont property came as much from Yates' need to reestablish distance as from William's increasing restlessness to see his land. They set out early one morning, Yates, Grace, William, and two ranch hands as additional protection. The Fremont property lay 15 miles northeast of the Lazy R, nestled against the foothills. As they crested the final rise, the small valley spread before them, a creek winding through it, a weathered but sound cabin backed against a rocky outcrop, and behind it, the remains of what had once been a modest orchard. Grace's face lit with excitement as she took in the scene. It's perfect, she breathed, urging her horse forward. The cabin proved surprisingly intact despite years of neglect. Built of solid timber with a stone fireplace, it offered basic but adequate shelter. While William and the hands inspected the outbuildings, Yates found himself following Grace as she explored what remained of the orchard. Most of these trees are too far gone, she said, examining the gnarled trunks. But some might be salvageable with proper pruning. She moved among them with the confidence of someone who saw not what was, but what could be, and there's room here for at least 50 more trees. Winter's coming, Yates reminded her. You'd be looking at spring planting at the earliest. Grace nodded, undeterred. That gives us time to prepare the soil properly. Uncle William mentioned a nursery in Helena that might have suitable saplings. Us, Yates questioned, catching the plural. Grace looked at him directly. I value your opinion, Yates. You know this land, its challenges. I'd welcome your guidance. The simple acknowledgement of respect touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. In that moment, watching her stand among the twisted apple trees with determination shining in her eyes, Yates realized how much he'd come to admire her. The sound of approaching riders shattered the moment. Yates instinctively reached for his gun as 6 mounted men appeared at the edge of the property. Get to the cabin, he ordered Grace, recognizing the lead rider from descriptions as Tucker Harker himself. I'm not leaving you out here alone, she protested. Now, Grace, Yates insisted, positioning himself between her and the approaching men, warn the others. He watched from the corner of his eye as she reluctantly retreated, then turned his full attention to the riders who had stopped 30 yards away. This is private property, Yates called out, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. Tucker Harker, a bear of a man with a thick beard and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. Just passing through, friend, couldn't help noticing the pretty lady. His gaze slid past Yates toward the cabin. Don't often see quality like that out here. She's not your concern, Yates replied evenly. Best you move along. Harker chuckled, the sound sending a chill down Yates' spine. Thing is, we've had our eye on that one since Helena. Followed their stage, but you interfered. Thought they might be heading to your spread permanently, but looks like they're setting up here. He leaned forward in his saddle. Isolated spot. Shame if something happened to them. Yates' jaw tightened as he understood the implied threat. The lady and her uncle are under my protection. Anyone who threatens them answers to me and every man on the Lazy R. Big talk for one man standing alone, Harker observed, his men spreading out slightly behind him. William and the ranch hands had emerged from the cabin, rifles ready. Grace stood in the doorway, the small derringer visible in her hand. He's not alone, William called firmly. Harker assessed the situation, clearly weighing the odds. After a tense moment, he straightened in his saddle. Another time, then, he tipped his hat mockingly. Ma'am, we'll be seeing you again. As the riders departed, Yates felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This wasn't over. Harker wasn't a man to be thwarted, and his interest in Grace had become personal. The incident confirmed what Yates had already suspected. The Fremonts couldn't safely occupy their property until the Harker gang was dealt with. The return to the Lazy R was somber, each rider lost in thought. That evening, after William had retired, Yates found Grace on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the November chill. You can't stay at the cabin, he said without preamble. Not while Harker's at large. Grace nodded, surprising him with her lack of argument. I know. I saw how he looked at me, she shivered slightly, like I was merchandise. The vulnerability in her voice stirred a fierce protectiveness in Yates. He moved closer, resisting the urge to put his arm around her. Sheriff Dawson's organizing a posse, he informed her. They're determined to run the Harkers to ground before winter fully sets in. And will you join them? Grace asked, her eyes searching his face. I need to, Yates answered honestly. Not just for law and order, but because, he hesitated, then continued, because I can't stand the thought of you living in fear. The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Grace's expression softened and she reached out to touch his arm lightly. Be careful, she said simply. I've lost too many people I care about already. The quiet acknowledgement that he had become someone she cared about both exhilarated and terrified him. Yates covered her hand with his own briefly, then stepped back, re-establishing a safer distance. "The posse leaves at dawn," he said. "I've asked Jenkins to oversee the ranch while I'm gone, Mrs. Hannigan will see to anything you need." "I'll keep the ledgers current," Grace promised with a small smile, "and perhaps finally teach your cook to make a proper Boston cream pie." Her attempt at lightness eased the tension, and Yates found himself smiling in return. "I'll hold you to that when I return." They stood together a moment longer, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. Then Yates turned and left her there, afraid that if he stayed, he might say or do something that couldn't be undone. The posse departed as planned the next morning, 12 men in all, led by Sheriff Dawson, with Yates serving as guide due to his knowledge of the territory. Grace and William stood on the porch to see them off, and Yates carried the image of Grace's worried face with him as they rode out. For 2 weeks they tracked the Harker gang through increasingly rough country. The weather worsened as November deepened, with snowstorms making tracking difficult. They found abandoned camps, signs of the gang's passage, but always a day or two behind. Then, near a remote mining settlement, they got their break. A prospector reported seeing men matching the Harkers' description at an abandoned mining cabin in a narrow canyon. The posse approached cautiously, splitting into 2 groups to cover both ends of the canyon. The ensuing gunfight was brief but violent. Caught by surprise, the Harkers fought desperately. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of the posse lay wounded, one of the Harker gang was dead and 3 others captured, but Tucker Harker and his brother had escaped on foot into the rugged terrain. Dawson organized the wounded and prisoners for the return journey, but Yates and 3 others volunteered to continue tracking the Harker brothers. "They're heading north," Yates observed, studying the tracks in the fresh snow. "Likely trying to reach the Canadian border." For 3 more days they followed the increasingly desperate trail. The Harkers, injured and without supplies, made mistakes. On the 4th day they caught up to the brothers attempting to steal horses from a trapper's cabin. The final confrontation left both Harkers dead, but not before Tucker's bullet grazed Yates' temple, leaving him with a bloody furrow and brief unconsciousness. By the time they returned to Cottonwood Springs, nearly a month had passed since their departure. Word had already reached town of the posse's success. As they rode wearily down Main Street, people emerged from shops and homes to cheer their return. But Yates had eyes only for the slender figure standing outside the general store, her honey-blonde hair visible beneath her bonnet. Grace pushed through the small crowd as Yates dismounted. Her eyes widened at the sight of the bandage around his head, and without hesitation she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "You came back," she whispered against his chest. Yates stood frozen for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace. "Public opinion be damned. I promised I would." Something fundamental had shifted during his absence. The weeks spent tracking the Harkers, facing death daily, had crystallized what truly mattered. The isolation he'd clung to for so long suddenly seemed like a hollow protection against life's uncertainties. As they walked together back to where William waited with their wagon, Yates made a decision. "The Harkers are finished," he told them. "You'll be safe at your property now." Grace studied his face, sensing something behind his words. "That's welcome news." "I thought," Yates hesitated, then pressed on, "I thought perhaps you might need help getting the cabin ready before winter sets in properly, and there's the orchard to consider." William smiled knowingly. "We would certainly welcome any assistance you could provide, Yates." The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Yates divided his time between the Lazy R and helping the Fremonts establish their homestead. The cabin was repaired, chinked against winter drafts, and furnished with basic necessities. Grace threw herself into planning for the orchard, ordering saplings to be delivered in spring and studying soil conditions. As Christmas approached, the Fremonts invited Yates to share the holiday at their cabin. He arrived to find the simple interior transformed, evergreen boughs decorating the mantel, candles glowing warmly, and delicious aromas filling the air. Grace had worked culinary miracles with limited resources, producing a feast that reminded Yates of childhood Christmases long forgotten. After dinner, William tactfully retired early, leaving Yates and Grace sitting before the fire. In the flickering light, with snowflakes drifting past the windows, Yates found the courage to speak what had been in his heart for months. When I first met you, he began quietly, I believed the frontier was no place for dreams or attachments. That survival was the only goal worth having. Grace turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and now. Now I understand that surviving isn't the same as living. Yates reached for her hand. These past months, watching you build something from nothing, seeing your determination and hope, it's changed how I see things. A smile touched Grace's lips. For someone who claims to dislike talk, you've become quite eloquent. Yates laughed softly. Only with you? He paused, gathering his thoughts. I came west thinking I needed to stand alone to be strong. You came seeking freedom to build your own life. Maybe we were both partly right and partly wrong. How so? She asked, her fingers warm against his. Standing alone isn't strength if it means cutting yourself off from what gives life meaning, Yates said slowly. And freedom, true freedom, might be found in choosing to bind yourself to someone who respects your dreams as much as their own. Grace's eyes widened slightly as she understood his meaning. Are you suggesting a partnership, Mr. Rutherford? I'm suggesting more than that, Yates replied, his voice dropping. I'm asking if you might consider a life where your orchard and my ranch become one operation. Where we face the frontier not alone, but together. Are you proposing marriage? Grace asked directly, her characteristic forthrightness making him smile. Inelegantly, perhaps, he admitted. But yes, I am. He looked into her eyes earnestly. I love you, Grace. I think I have since you pointed that derringer at me and demanded to know my intentions. Grace laughed, the sound warm and free. I was rather forward, wasn't I? You were magnificent, Yates corrected her. You still are. Grace reached up to touch his face gently. I came west seeking independence, not expecting to find love, but perhaps true independence isn't the absence of connection, but the freedom to choose one's connections wisely. Is that a yes? Yates asked, hope rising in his chest. It's a yes, Grace confirmed, her smile radiant, on one condition. Name it. That we build something together that honors both our dreams, your ranch, my orchard, a legacy that combines both. I can think of nothing I want more, Yates said honestly, drawing her closer. The Lazy R could use some apple trees. And perhaps, eventually, children to climb them, Grace added softly. As their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with months of restrained feeling, Yates realized that the walls he'd built around his heart hadn't protected him, they'd only imprisoned him. In Grace's arms he found not vulnerability but strength, not confinement but the truest freedom he'd ever known. Spring arrived with renewal, the land awakening from winter's grip with explosive greenery. On a perfect May morning, with apple blossoms scenting the air from the first new plantings, Grace and Yates were married beneath an arch of flowering branches. The ceremony, held on the boundary where Lazy R land met Fremont property, symbolized the union of their separate dreams into one shared vision. William, standing proudly as Grace's only family, watched with satisfaction as the couple exchanged vows before the assembled ranch hands, townspeople, and neighboring settlers. Mrs. Hannigan sniffled audibly throughout, declaring it the finest wedding the territory has ever seen. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Yates led his bride to a quiet spot overlooking their combined lands. Happy? He asked, his arm around her waist. Grace leaned against him, surveying the vista before them, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the neat rows of young apple trees, the sturdy ranch house where they would make their home. More than I ever imagined possible, she answered truthfully. I came west speaking of freedom, determined to stand on my own. And now? Yates asked, turning her to face him. Grace smiled up at the man who had shown her that independence and love were not opposing forces, but complementary strengths. Now I understand that the truest freedom lies in choosing where to place your heart. She reached up to trace his jaw tenderly. And mine is exactly where it belongs. As the setting sun gilded the Montana landscape, casting long shadows across the land they would cultivate together, Yates pulled his wife close. In finding each other, they had not surrendered their dreams but expanded them, creating something stronger and more enduring than either could have built alone. The wild frontier that had once seemed to demand isolation as the price of survival now witnessed a different truth. That in the harshest of environments it was connection, not separation, that ensured not merely survival, but a life rich with purpose and joy.